Welcome, fellow deep divers. Today, I want you to cast your mind's eye across the incredibly varied landscapes of Europe.
Hmm.
Imagine the endless golden wheat fields in France, the fragmented, terraced vineyards clinging to Italian hillsides, or maybe those vast, newly consolidated tracts of land emerging in Eastern Europe.
It's quite a picture. A real tapestry.
It is, isn't it? Woven with centuries of history, culture, and fundamentally agriculture. But what if I told you that the ground beneath our feet, who owns it, how it's used, and even who gets to farm it, is caught in this fascinating, sometimes fierce, tug of war?
A tug of war between national traditions, economic pressures, and crucially, the overarching principles of the European Union.
Exactly.
It's a truly intricate system,
Yeah.
far more than just soil and seeds. Understanding these dynamics is absolutely essential if we want to grasp the future of Europe's food security, rural economies, even national identity itself.
That's it. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive designed to give you a truly well-informed shortcut into this complex, often contentious world of agricultural land market regulations across the European Union.
And it's not just about farming, is it?
Not at all. It touches everything from our dinner plates to the delicate balance of national sovereignty and the very essence of the EU's internal market. It's really a foundational element of Europe's economic and social fabric.
And our primary guide for this exploration is a really comprehensive 2021 technical report from the Joint Research Center, the JRC.
That's the European Commission's own science and knowledge service, right?
Precisely. This report gives us a detailed snapshot of land market regulations across 22 EU member states as of 2020. It's built on rigorous expert surveys, in-depth interviews, and detailed country reports. So it's a pretty robust foundation for our discussion.
And to make sure you get the most current and practical understanding, we'll also be weaving in insights from more recent legal analyses.
Including some landmark decisions from the Court of Justice of the European Union, the CJEU, which have really shaken things up in some places.
We'll even dip into some discussions from platforms like Reddit just to see how these issues resonate, on the ground with everyday people.
Our mission today is really to unpack these often opaque regulations. We'll delve into their stated objectives.
And crucially, their surprising and sometimes counterintuitive impacts.
Yes, and explore the ongoing debates that are actively shaping Europe's agricultural future. And to bring these abstract policies to life, we'll take a special look at Bulgaria.
Ah, yes, a nation that has recently experienced some very significant legal shifts in its land market. That should be fascinating.
Definitely.
So, what does this whole mosaic of rules mean for the future of farming and rural development across Europe? Let's unearth it.
Let's dig in.
Okay, so to begin, let's establish why agricultural land and its regulation are so incredibly vital. It seems to be far more than just a place to grow food, doesn't it? What makes it such a linchpin?
You've hit on the core point right there. Agricultural land isn't just a commodity. It's a truly multifaceted asset, almost uniquely so.
How so?
Well, first and foremost, it's an economic pillar. I mean, think about it. It's the fundamental factor of production for all agricultural goods.
Right. No land, no food. Simple as that.
Exactly. Without land, you don't have food production, you don't have livelihoods for farmers, and you simply can't ensure food security for millions of people. It's the very bedrock of our food systems.
And it stretches beyond just the pure economics, doesn't it? It seems deeply interwoven with society itself.
Absolutely. Land is a societal engine. It's instrumental for the development of rural regions, generating significant economic, environmental, and social benefits.
You mean like supporting rural communities?
Yes, it's where generations of families have lived and worked, forming the cultural and social backbone of countless communities. It shapes landscapes, supports biodiversity, underpins the social structures of rural life. I mean, when we talk about land, we're often talking about heritage and community resilience, too.
And then there's a side of it that perhaps the average person doesn't immediately consider its role as a financial asset.
Indeed, land functions as a powerful store of wealth. It's a significant financial asset that often acts as a hedge against inflation.
Ah, okay. So it's attractive to investors, not just farmers.
Exactly.
Okay.
That makes it incredibly attractive to a diverse range of investors, extending well beyond just traditional farming interests. Beyond that, the existence of well-functioning land markets is vital for developing robust credit markets.
How does that work? Land as collateral.
Precisely. When land can be used as collateral, it de-risks loans and stimulates productive investments in that land. Farmers can borrow against their assets to expand, modernize, or adopt new technologies.
Which they might not be able to do otherwise.
Especially when tenure and property rights are secure and clearly defined, that security is key.
Okay, so given this immense, multifaceted value, economic, social, financial snoop, it's hardly surprising that governments worldwide step in to regulate it. What's the driving force behind this regulatory imperative within the EU specifically?
Well, governments, both globally and within the EU, intervene in land markets precisely because of this multifaceted importance we've just discussed.
They feel they have to manage it somehow.
Right. These regulations directly and indirectly affect the supply and demand for land, impacting both sales transactions and, crucially, rental transactions too.
And they can actually restrict what owners can do.
They can impose significant restrictions on individual property rights. We're talking about things like how long you can own land, what you're permitted to use it for, the security of your tenure if you're a tenant, and even how easily you can transfer or sell it.
So quite far-reaching controls.
Yes, the objective is often to manage potential negative externalities, protect what's seen as a vital national resource, and ensure broader societal goals are met, not just purely market outcomes.
And these regulations don't operate in a vacuum, do they? I imagine they interact with other major policies.
Precisely. They significantly interact with broader agricultural policies, most notably the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP.
Ah, the CAP, the EU's big agricultural subsidy program.
Exactly. Key subsidies, for example, can become capitalized into land prices. Essentially, the value of the subsidy gets baked into the price or rent of the land.
Meaning landowners benefit, maybe more than the farmers?
It can mean that. And crucially, if land regulations differ significantly across countries, which they do, the redistributive impact of these very large subsidies will also vary.
So the same subsidy payment might have a different effect in France compared to, say, Poland because of the local land rules.
That's right. It can potentially create an uneven playing field for farmers and landowners across different member states.
And what about the long-term structure of farming itself? I imagine these laws influence how farms evolve over time, generational change and all that.
Absolutely. Land laws profoundly influence structural change in agriculture. They affect how land gets reallocated among farms, shifting between larger and smaller operations, for instance.
And they impact who decides to become a farmer in the first place.
Critically, yes. They play a major role in individuals' decisions to enter or exit farming. This has direct implications for crucial issues like generational renewal, especially in a sector that is, let's face it, increasingly facing an aging workforce across much of Europe.
So if young farmers can't get access to land, that's a huge problem for the future.
It's a fundamental barrier. Access to land is everything.
Okay, so when it comes to farmers accessing land, there's that fundamental strategic choice: ownership versus rental. And our sources point out that rental markets actually offer some quite distinct advantages, don't they? Which might seem a bit counterintuitive at first.
They do, and this is where it gets particularly interesting for things like efficiency and flexibility. Rental markets allow for more nimble adjustments in farm size with relatively low transaction costs compared to buying and selling.
Meaning it's easier to scale up or down as needed.
Exactly. This makes it easier for land to be reallocated, perhaps moving towards more efficient producers as farms expand or contract based on market needs or technological changes.
And the upfront cost must be a huge factor.
Absolutely crucial. Renting significantly reduces the initial capital outlay required for accessing land. This leaves more capital for farmers to invest in productive assets. Think modern machinery, irrigation systems, advanced technology, better seeds.
Rather than tying it all up in just buying the land itself.
Precisely. Especially for new entrants.
That sounds like it could be a real game changer for those new entrants, particularly young farmers, maybe.
It truly can be. Renting can significantly facilitate structural change by encouraging new entrants, particularly young farmers, who are often, let's be honest, credit constrained.
They just don't have the capital for a down payment on land.
Exactly. Renting allows them to get started, gain experience, and build their business without that massive upfront burden of land acquisition, which can otherwise be an absolutely insurmountable barrier.
And we have a fascinating case study for how these rental systems play out in practice, the Irish conifer system. Can you walk us through that? It sounds quite specific.
It is, and the conifer system in Ireland offers a really powerful illustration of how historical anxieties can shape land markets even today. A substantial amount of rented agricultural land in Ireland, we're talking maybe 60–65%, is rented under these very short, typically 11-month agreements.
11 months, that's incredibly short term. Why?
While landowners historically preferred this due to deep-seated fears of losing control or even ownership of their land, Historically, if land was leased for longer periods, tenants could potentially gain legal rights, or it could even become subject to compulsory purchase by the state's land commission. So these short-term agreements emerged as a way for landowners to retain maximum control and avoid those perceived risks.
Okay, so it offers incredible flexibility for the landowner. But what's the flip side? What about the farmer renting the land? What does it mean for them?
That's the critical downside, isn't it? While it offers flexibility for landowners, it severely hinders tenants from making any kind of long-term production efficiency plans.
Because they don't know if they'll have the land next year.
Exactly. If you only have the land for 11 months, why would you invest in improving soil health over multiple years, or installing permanent drainage systems, or planning complex multi-year crop rotations that yield benefits over a longer time frame?
You just wouldn't. The incentive isn't there.
Right. Despite policy reforms and even tax incentives introduced back in 2012 aimed at encouraging longer-term leases, conifer remains surprisingly prevalent. It's a really stark example of how deeply ingrained practices and historical fears can resist policy intentions, even when there are financial incentives to change.
That's a great illustration of policy intentions running up against, well, reality and history. Now, to make sense of all these diverse regulations across the 22 member states studied, the JRC report developed a really clear analytical framework. They categorized measures into 5 main groups. Could you walk us through those categories? It seems essential for comparing across countries.
Certainly, and this categorization is pretty indispensable for any structured analysis and meaningful comparison across member states. It helps bring order to the complexity.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, M1 is measures to protect the tenant. This category specifically addresses aspects like rental contract stability and ensuring fairness for the farmer who's leasing the land. Think minimum lease lengths, rent controls, things like that.
Okay, protecting the person farming the land. Makes sense. What's M2?
Next, M2 covers measures to protect the farmland owner. These regulations typically aim to preserve local ownership, maybe keep land in the hands of farming families, and ensure the land continues to be used for agricultural purposes, not converted to something else.
Got it. Protecting the owner and the land's use.
Yeah.
Then M3. This one sounded a bit unusual.
Then we have M3, measures to protect non-farmland owners. This might sound a bit counterintuitive at first glance, you're right.
Yeah, how do you protect someone not farming?
It can involve rules designed to ensure land eventually becomes available again for a broader pool of potential farmers, rather than being locked up indefinitely. Or it might simply establish basic market rules that protect land values for owners who aren't actively farming, like setting minimum rents for state land.
Okay, I see. And M4.
M4 focuses on measures to prevent fragmentation, which directly tackles that challenge we mentioned of farms being composed of numerous small scattered plots. So rules about minimum plot sizes for sales or subdivisions.
Right, trying to keep fields economically viable. And the last one.
And finally, M5 serves as a comprehensive category for other measures targeting the agricultural land market. It's a bit of a catch-all, encompassing a wide range of diverse regulations that influence transactions and market dynamics, things like publication requirements for sales, rules for public land, or moratoriums on resale.
So a place for everything else that affects the market. And the report even goes so far as to quantify these measures somehow.
Yes, precisely. These measures are quantified using numerical scales. This allows researchers to compare the relative strictness or liberality of regulatory environments across those 22 member states studied. It provides an empirical basis for analysis that moves beyond just describing the rules.
Okay, super helpful framework. So, with that in mind, let's start decoding these rules. We'll begin with M1, safeguarding the tenant. What are the core elements here, and what are countries ultimately trying to achieve with these protections?
Right, M1 is all about creating stability and security for farmers who don't own the land they cultivate. The core elements typically include regulations on minimum rental contract duration.
So, guaranteeing them the land for a certain period?
Yes.
Wow.
Also, potentially setting maximum rental prices, rules around automatic contract renewal, defining clear conditions under which a contract can be terminated.
Preventing arbitrary evictions.
Exactly. And often granting tenants preemptive rights, the right of first refusal to renew the contract, or sometimes even purchase the land if the owner decides to sell.
And the goals behind all this?
The primary goals are pretty clear. Enhance tenure security for farmers, which in turn helps stabilize agricultural production over the longer term, and also protect, perhaps, credit-constrained farmers by reducing their initial capital outlay needed for land purchase. It's about creating a predictable, secure environment for them to operate and invest in their farming activities.
So, giving farmers certainty and protecting them from sudden price hikes or losing the land unexpectedly, can you give us some concrete examples of how countries actually implement this? Where is tenant protection particularly strong?
Certainly. Countries like Belgium and France are often cited as having very high levels of tenant protection. In Belgium, for example, maximum rental prices aren't just suggestions. They're set based on a specific government-determined cadastral income, which is linked to the land's potential productivity,
So, rent control, essentially.
pretty much. And significantly, landlords need a full 2 years' notice if they wish to terminate a contract because they intend to cultivate the land themselves.
2 years. That's a very long lead time for a landlord to get their own land back.
It is. It makes it quite challenging for a landlord to regain direct control quickly, offering substantial security to the tenant.
What about France, which you mentioned also has strict regulations? How do they compare?
France has similarly stringent tenancy rules. They have regulated rental price ranges set by the state, not just maximums. And minimum lease durations are notably long, typically 9, 18, or even 25 years.
25 years.
Yes, and there are even tax incentives for landlords who offer the 18-year contracts, encouraging longer terms. Crucially, these contracts automatically renew unless specific conditions are met, and they are generally inheritable, meaning they can pass down through generations of the tenant farming family,
Wow. So a tenant could be there for decades, potentially.
potentially. A landowner can only withdraw the land if they, or their direct heirs, genuinely intend to farm it themselves for at least 9 years. So once a tenant is established, they have profound security of tenure.
That's really locking the land up, in a way. What about other countries, maybe like Slovakia or Spain? Are the rules as strict there?
They have significant protections, though maybe not quite as extreme as France or Belgium. In Slovakia, rental contracts for agricultural enterprises have a mandated minimum duration of 5 years and a maximum of 15 years. They also have a legally established minimum rent, typically 1% of the land value.
A minimum this time, not a maximum.
Yes, though interestingly, the state-controlled Slovak Land Fund actually sets its minimum at a higher 2.2% for the land it leases out. And tenants also benefit from a preemptive right to enter into a new contract when the current one expires.
Okay. And Spain?
Spain, similarly, mandates a minimum duration of 5 years for rental contracts. These contracts automatically renew for that same initial duration, and they're also inheritable by the tenant's heirs. So, still significant security, but perhaps with slightly shorter guaranteed terms initially.
These all sound like genuine protections for tenants, clearly designed with good intentions, right, to provide stability. But do such strict regulations ever have unintended consequences, perhaps even negative ones for the market overall?
This is where it gets truly fascinating, and where those good intentions can sometimes lead to what economists call perverse effects. While the aim is unequivocally to protect tenants, excessively strict regulations can actually backfire.
How so?
They can make landlords less willing to rent out their land in the first place.
Because they fear losing control or flexibility.
Exactly. If a landlord knows it's extremely difficult, costly, or takes years to regain control of their land once it's rented out under these strict rules, they might just choose not to rent it at all.
So if they're less willing to rent, what does that practically mean for the market? What do they do with the land instead?
Well, that reluctance to rent can lead to higher sale prices for what's called free land
Right.
not already under a long-term protected rental contract because there's simply less rental supply available.
Making it harder to buy land, too.
Yes. It can, paradoxically, make it even harder for young or expanding farmers to access land, whether through renting or buying. The supply of rental land shrinks, and sale prices for available land are driven up by the scarcity and the premium placed on flexibility by potential buyers.
So the very people the rules were meant to help new entrants might find it even harder to get started.
It's a potential unintended consequence. Furthermore, those automatic renewal provisions, while great for the current tenant, can mean that land remains with aging tenants who might be farming less intensively or perhaps are less inclined to adopt new sustainable practices. This could potentially hinder overall agricultural productivity and, again, that crucial issue of generational renewal in the sector.
So it's a really delicate balance between providing security for current tenants and maintaining dynamism and access in the market.
A very delicate balance indeed.
Okay, that's a crucial paradox.
Yeah.
Now let's move to M2, protecting the farmland owner and ensuring the land stays in agricultural use. What are the common types of regulations we see in this category?
This category, M2, introduces an even broader set of restrictions. And it's where we really see that tension between national interests and overarching EU principles come strongly to the forefront.
What kind of restrictions are we talking about?
We're talking about restrictions on the legal form of buyers, like can a corporation buy farmland? Restrictions based on the buyer's nationality or residence, often requirements about their agricultural experience or qualifications.
So you have to prove you're a farmer.
In some cases, yes. Some countries also impose maximum sales prices to control speculation or set limits on the maximum area of land that can be transacted or owned by a single entity.
Preventing concentration of ownership.
Exactly. And very commonly, you'll find preemptive rights granted to specific types of buyers, like neighboring farmers, existing tenants, or sometimes even state bodies, giving them first refusal on a sale.
And the objectives driving these regulations seem quite clear, I imagine. Protecting the local farm structure.
They are, generally. These measures usually aim to protect traditional family farms, support local, small-scale, and particularly young farmers. They also seek to ensure that land remains in productive agricultural use, rather than being bought up for development or just held passively. And a big driver is often preventing speculation or excessive land concentration, especially by large-scale corporate investors or foreign buyers who might not have a long-term commitment to the land's agricultural purpose or the local community.
So, really trying to keep land in the hands of active farmers, particularly local ones. Can you give us some striking examples here? How far do countries go?
Absolutely. Take Hungary and Poland, for instance. They have very strict rules that basically prohibit legal entities, companies, from owning agricultural land, with only very specific, limited historical exceptions.
Wow, so only individuals can own farmland there.
Largely, yes. This is a direct attempt to favor natural persons, individual farmers and families, over corporate entities, reinforcing a particular traditional vision of agricultural structure.
That's a very strong stance. What about those nationality and residence restrictions? You mentioned they've often been hot topics under EU law.
They are indeed particularly sensitive areas, politically and legally. And they've frequently been challenged under the EU's fundamental principle of free movement of capital.
Because they discriminate against non-nationals or non-residents?
That's the argument. For instance, before a very recent change, which we'll definitely discuss later, Bulgaria required natural persons to reside in the country for 5 years.
5 years?
Yes. And legal entities had to be established for 5 years, or their partners or founders had to reside for 5 or more years before they could legally acquire agricultural land.
That's a significant barrier for outside investors.
Absolutely. Croatia has similar, often temporary restrictions on foreign owners that were negotiated as part of their EU accession. And countries like Poland and Romania also have various residence requirements for buyers. The clear goal is to keep land ownership local, but these policies are frequently scrutinized by the EU Commission and the CJEU for potential breaches of EU law.
And what about ensuring the buyer actually farms the land and doesn't just hold it as a passive investment? You mentioned experience requirements.
Yes, many countries, including Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Slovenia, require buyers to demonstrate agricultural experience or specific qualifications to acquire land.
How do they justify that?
The stated intention is usually to ensure proper farming practices, improve overall agricultural productivity, and promote environmental awareness among landowners. However, this can inadvertently limit entry for individuals who might bring other incredibly valuable skills to modern farming.
Like tech skills or business management.
Exactly. Cutting-edge technical expertise in areas like precision farming, advanced managerial acumen for running large operations, or innovative business models. If these skills aren't strictly classified as agricultural experience, potential innovators might be excluded.
It raises a crucial question about what truly constitutes a qualified farmer in the 21st century, doesn't it?
It really does. Is it just about traditional farming know-how, or also about adapting to new technologies and market demands?
So it's not just about who can buy, but also about how sales happen. I understand some countries even require administrative approval for agricultural land sales, like getting permission from a government body.
That's right. Countries like Germany, France, and Austria operate with systems requiring administrative approval for agricultural land sales. Permission needs to be granted before the sale can be finalized.
And on what grounds can they deny approval?
Approval can be denied for various reasons. For example, if the sale would lead to what's deemed an unhealthy distribution of land, perhaps concentrating too much land in one hand, or if it leads to uneconomical fragmentation, breaking up viable farm units, or even if the price is considered excessive, suggesting speculation.
Price controls again.
In a way, Germany, for instance, can deny a sale if the price is 50% or more above the value of comparable plots in the area, specifically aiming to curb price speculation.
And France has those famous SAFERs, right? They seem quite powerful.
Yes, France's Safer Société d'Aménagement Foncier et d'Établissement Rural are particularly active and interventionist. They don't just approve or deny, they can actively intervene in sales. They can use preemptive rights to buy the land themselves and then resell it, specifically favoring installations of young farmers or projects that lead to land consolidation. They play a very hands-on role in shaping the market according to specific policy goals.
Very interventionist indeed. And then there are those preemptive rights we keep mentioning, where certain parties get first dibs on buying land. How do these work in practice when protecting owners or agricultural use?
Exactly. Many countries grant preemptive rights, often to neighboring farmers. We see this widely in places like Bulgaria, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, Italy, Austria, Estonia, Spain. It's quite common.
And the idea is consolidation.
Primarily, yes. The logic is that allowing neighbors to buy adjacent land can help consolidate fragmented holdings into larger, more efficient blocks. However, it can also inadvertently favor larger, more established farmers who already have the financial resources to exercise these rights.
Compared to smaller farmers or new entrants who might not have the cash ready.
Precisely. So, while aiming for consolidation, it might also, in some cases, reinforce existing power structures and make it harder for smaller players to expand.
This whole M2 area seems to be a constant tug of war, especially when it comes to EU law versus national preferences. How does this tension play out day to day?
That's truly the core tension. You've nailed it. It's at the heart of European land policy debates. On one side, you have the EU's fundamental principle of free movement of capital, which, according to EU treaties, applies to agricultural land just like any other asset within the internal market.
So theoretically, a German investor should be able to buy land in Poland as easily as a Polish citizen.
Theoretically, yes, based purely on the free movement of capital principle. But on the other side, member states legitimately want to impose restrictions to protect what they see as vital public interests related to agricultural land.
Like preserving rural communities.
Yes, things like preserving agricultural communities, ensuring sustainable agriculture, preventing excessive land speculation that could price local farmers out of the market. The EU treaties actually acknowledge the distinctive nature of agricultural land, which does allow for proportionate restrictions based on legitimate public interest objectives.
Ah, but it all comes down to defining a proportionate, doesn't it? That sounds like the tricky part.
Precisely. The challenge lies entirely in defining what constitutes proportionate protection. Restrictions must be suitable for achieving the objective, necessary, and not go beyond what's required. This ambiguity frequently leads to ongoing legal scrutiny and significant rulings by the Court of Justice of the European Union, the CJEU.
We mentioned the recent Bulgarian case. Have there been others?
Oh, yes. For instance, the CJEU has ruled on cases like Latvia's requirement for foreign investors in agricultural land to demonstrate proficiency in the Latvian language, ultimately deeming it a disproportionate barrier and thus a violation of EU law, specifically the freedom of establishment in that case.
So the court pushes back against rules seen as too restrictive.
It does. But what's interesting, as the JRC report notes, is that despite these rulings, and the European Commission often flagging specific national regulations as potentially discriminatory or disproportionate, many of these contested regulations still remain in place in various countries.
Why is that? Political resistance.
Often political resistance, yes, or lengthy processes to change national laws. It illustrates this persistent and often unresolved legal and political balancing act between national sovereignty concerns and EU single market principles when it comes to something as sensitive as land.
That's a crucial tension, unlikely to go away soon. Now, the third category, M3, was measures to protect the non-farmland owner. This one still seems less intuitive. How exactly does a regulation protect someone who isn't even farming the land? What's the angle here?
You're right. It's not immediately obvious, but it's about balancing interests. This category primarily includes measures like setting a minimum rental price for public land and, perhaps surprisingly, setting a maximum rental contract duration.
Okay, a maximum duration again. We talked about that under tenant protection potentially being bad for landlords. How does it protect a non-farming owner here? Wouldn't they want longer, more stable income from a tenant?
While stable income is good, a maximum tenancy duration protects non-farm owners. Think someone who inherited land but lives elsewhere, by ensuring that the land eventually becomes available again. It prevents it from being perpetually tied up with a single tenant through automatic indefinite renewals, which can happen under very strict M1 tenant protection rules.
So it gives the owner back some control eventually.
Exactly. It gives landowners more flexibility in the long run to adjust to changing market conditions, perhaps decide to sell the land if they need to, or maybe bring in new farmers with fresh ideas or different farming plans. It ensures a degree of land nobility and prevents situations where the land is effectively locked up for generations with one tenant family, which might not align with the non-farming owner's long-term interests or financial needs.
Okay, that makes sense. And the minimum rental price, you mentioned that's mainly for state land.
Yes, that's primarily applied to state-owned land, rather than private landlord-tenant relationships. The objective here is quite specific: to prevent public land, a public asset, from being leased out at excessively low, undervalued rates to the private sector.
To stop sweetheart deals or corruption.
Essentially, yes. We've seen this implemented in countries like Croatia, Latvia, and Lithuania. It's a mechanism to ensure that public assets are managed responsibly and generate fair value for the public purse, preventing potential misuse or deals that could disadvantage the state and taxpayers. So ultimately, these M3 regulations aim to balance the rights and interests of various stakeholders: tenants, farming owners, non-farming owners, and the state, ensuring land access and fair value across the board.
Okay, understood. We've covered how regulations try to protect both tenants and owners. Now let's shift our focus to shaping the agricultural landscape itself, starting with M4, combating fragmentation. This is a really tangible problem on the ground, isn't it? Driving through parts of Europe, you often see these tiny, oddly shaped plots all over the place.
It absolutely is, and it's a massive structural challenge in many parts of Europe, often stemming from historical inheritance laws or land reforms. Land fragmentation, where farms consist of many small, often widely scattered plots, is widely considered detrimental to modern agricultural efficiency.
Why exactly? What are the main problems it causes?
It dramatically increases operational costs. Just think of the extra travel time and fuel spent moving machinery between tiny fields, sometimes miles apart. Think of the productive land lost just to boundaries, fences, and access routes between these small plots. And there's the sheer difficulty, or even impossibility, of using large, modern, efficient machinery effectively across dozens of tiny, maybe irregularly shaped plots.
So it directly hinders economies of scale. You can't farm efficiently like that.
Precisely. It makes it much harder to compete, especially in arable farming, which relies heavily on mechanization.
But I seem to recall reading somewhere, or maybe you mentioned earlier, that fragmentation isn't always seen as purely bad, that there can be some unexpected upsides, or at least arguments made for it.
That's a fascinating and important nuance, actually, and it highlights the complexity of agricultural systems and local contexts. While largely viewed as negative from a pure economic efficiency standpoint, some scholars, and indeed some farmers, argue that a degree of fragmentation can actually have advantages, particularly in certain farming systems or environments.
Like what kind of advantages?
For example, having plots scattered across different locations might mean different soil conditions or microclimates. This heterogeneity can actually reduce the risk of total crop failure if a localized disease, pest outbreak, or extreme weather event like hail hits one specific area.
Spreading the risk, essentially.
Exactly. It can also allow for a wider mix of crops to be grown, catering to different soil types or market niches. Some argue it can even ease seasonal labor bottlenecks by spreading out planting or harvesting tasks across different plots, ripening at slightly different times. And potentially, it helps smooth a farmer's income by diversifying that environmental risk.
So it's not entirely a black and white issue, especially maybe for smaller, more diverse farms.
It's not black and white, especially where other market imperfections exist, like poor access to insurance or credit. The downsides often outweigh the benefits for commercial farming, but the potential upsides are worth acknowledging.
That's a really interesting counterpoint. So whether it's seen as mostly bad or having niche benefits, how do regulations specifically try to address land fragmentation? What are the M4 measures?
Regulatory responses vary quite a bit in how direct they are. Some countries, like Bulgaria, Spain, and Slovakia, impose absolute minimum size limits below which a plot of agricultural land simply cannot be subdivided during a transaction, like a sale or inheritance. It's a hard stop to prevent plots from getting even smaller.
So you can't sell off half a tiny plot if it takes it below the limit.
Correct. Croatia goes a step further in some cases, prohibiting the subdivision even of plots that have already been consolidated through previous state-sponsored programs to protect those gains.
And Austria had that rule about refusing sales.
Yes. Austria gives the administrative authorities the power to refuse approval for a land sale if it would lead to unfavorable plot sizes or disrupt what they consider a favorable land ownership structure. This gives them quite broad discretion to prevent fragmentation through sales.
And preemptive rights come up again here too, don't they? It seems like they're a really versatile regulatory tool used for many different goals.
They absolutely are. They pop up everywhere. In the context of fragmentation, M4, many countries grant preemptive rights specifically to co-owners of a plot of land.
Ah, so if multiple people inherit a field, one heir gets first chance to buy out the others.
Exactly. This helps to limit further physical subdivision of the plot and can ease the process of land consolidation, perhaps allowing one heir who wants to continue farming to take over the whole plot rather than splitting it into even tinier unworkable pieces. We see this co-owner preemption right in places like Czechia, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, Slovenia, and Slovakia.
You mentioned Czechia earlier as having a particularly challenging situation with fragmentation. Can you remind us what that looks like on the ground there?
Yes, Czechia faces, or at least faced, extreme land ownership fragmentation. Back in 2017, they had an astonishing 3.25 million private owners of agricultural land.
3.25 million owners.
Yes, and half of whom owned less than a quarter of a hectare each. Tiny, tiny parcels. Imagine trying to manage a commercially viable farm composed of potentially dozens or even hundreds of these tiny, scattered plots owned by different people. It's an administrative and logistical nightmare just figuring out who owns what and getting agreements.
So how does farming even happen?
Well, despite this extreme ownership fragmentation, what's striking is that land use in Czechia is surprisingly less fragmented. This is largely due to very high rental rates. About 74% of agricultural land was rented in 2020.
Ah, so large farming companies rent land from thousands of tiny owners.
Often, yes. Large agricultural enterprises rent land from many small landowners and consolidate these plots into larger, more manageable operational units for farming. So the rental market acts as a crucial mechanism to overcome the inefficiencies of the fragmented ownership structure. However, land consolidation programs aimed at simplifying the ownership pattern itself remain a key, albeit slow and complex policy focus there.
That's a powerful example of how rental markets can, to some extent, compensate for ownership fragmentation. Now, let's explore the final category, M5, the other measures. This sounded like a broad category, a bit of a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit neatly elsewhere. What kinds of things fall under M5?
It is indeed a broad category, right? It encompasses a whole range of diverse regulations that don't fit perfectly into the other four specific protection. This includes things like requirements to publicly publish sale offers before a transaction can be completed, specific procedures and criteria for selling publicly owned land, rules around share deals, buying the company that owns land to prevent circumvention of direct land ownership rules, and various other forms of preemptive rights beyond just neighbors or co-owners' rights for state or public bodies, family relatives, or sometimes even just adjacent landowners, regardless of whether they are farmers.
And moratoriums, too, restrictions on resale.
Yes, it also covers temporary moratoriums that restrict the transfer of ownership for a certain period after acquisition, perhaps if public subsidies were involved, or restrictions on the sale of certain types of public land.
So a real mix of regulations indeed. What are the common objectives behind these varied other measures? What are countries trying to achieve with them?
Often, these measures aim to increase market transparency, making sure potential buyers or preemptors know land is for sale. They're also about ensuring proper and fair management of publicly owned land resources. A big goal is often preventing indirect land acquisition that circumvents direct land sale regulations.
Like that share deal loophole you mentioned.
Exactly. And generally, many M5 measures aim to retain local ownership or control, or at least give local actors or the state more influence over market outcomes. They reflect a desire for greater oversight and often provide specific policy levers for intervention.
Can you give us some key examples of how these M5 rules work in practice? That publication requirement sounds interesting.
Certainly. The requirement for publication of sale offers is quite common in countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Austria, Romania, and Slovenia. The idea is to provide formal opportunities for anyone holding preemptive rights, like neighbors, tenants, or the state, to exercise them. And theoretically, it's also meant to increase overall market transparency by making sale prices more visible.
But does it have downsides? Does it slow things down?
It can, yes. This publication requirement can significantly delay transactions, adding weeks or months to the process. And it can create considerable uncertainty for potential buyers, especially those who don't hold any preemptive rights themselves, as they wait to see if someone else will step in. This can make the market less fluid and potentially deter some buyers.
And public land management, that must be a huge area, especially in many post-socialist countries where the state used to own everything.
It's a very significant aspect in many Central and Eastern European countries, but also elsewhere. In Croatia, for instance, state-owned agricultural land is typically sold via public tender, often with limits on the maximum area that can be acquired, for example, a max of 50 hectares in continental areas. And buyers usually face a requirement to actively cultivate the land for at least 10 years to ensure it stays in productive use.
So using state land to promote active farming.
Yes, Hungary sells state land via auction, with a set minimum price to ensure fair value is received. Slovenia's Farmland and Forest Fund, the FFF, is a major institutional player. It actively manages state-owned land, often buying and selling parcels specifically to promote the consolidation of fragmented private properties into more economically rational sizes for farmers. So this public land is often used as a direct policy tool to influence market structure.
What about those moratoriums on ownership transfer you mentioned? It sounds like they're trying to lock the land into specific hands or uses for a period after a sale.
Exactly. That's the intent, to prevent quick speculative flipping of land, especially if public support was involved, or to ensure commitment to farming. Poland, for example, requires buyers of larger plots over 1 hectare to personally farm the land for at least 5 years, and strictly restricts them from selling or transferring it during this period without special permission.
5 years is a significant commitment.
It is. Similar restrictions exist in Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and Finland if specific tax reductions were granted upon acquisition, directly tying the tax benefit to long-term ownership and active use. And in Bulgaria, Czechia, and Latvia, you'll find similar moratoriums if the land was acquired directly from the state, preventing quick resale of formerly public assets. Ireland also applies a 5-year moratorium on resale if stamp duty tax reliefs were activated when the land was initially bought.
And share deal approvals. This sounds like a sophisticated measure to stop people from getting around the primary land ownership rules by just buying the company that holds the land rather than the land itself directly.
Precisely. It addresses a potential loophole. Countries like Denmark and Austria require administrative approval, not just for land sales, but also for transfers of shares in legal entities, companies that own significant amounts of agricultural land.
So they look through the corporate structure.
Yes. This is specifically designed to prevent indirect land acquisition that would otherwise circumvent regulations on direct land sales, nationality restrictions, or qualification requirements for buyers. Poland similarly requires consent for the Director General of the National Support Center for Agriculture for certain legal entities to acquire shares in companies owning farmland. It's a way to close potential loopholes and ensure the spirit, not just the letter, of the land laws is upheld, even when transactions are structured differently.
That makes sense. And the diverse preemptive rights under M5 beyond just farmers or co-owners are fascinating. Who else gets these rights?
Yes, it's quite varied. Preemptive rights can be granted to state or public bodies. It's seen in Germany, France, via the SAFERs, and Croatia, allowing for direct state intervention in the market to achieve public policy goals like nature conservation or infrastructure development.
Or preventing undesirable sales.
Right. They can also extend to family relatives, which is the case in Czechia, Poland, and Romania, specifically designed to facilitate smooth family farm succession and keep land within the family. Or rights can be granted simply to adjacent landowners, like in Estonia and Spain, which can promote local consolidation even if the neighbor isn't necessarily a farmer or co-owner. These rights serve various specific national policy goals.
So these other measures in M5 seem designed to exert a lot of quite specific control and influence on the market's direction. What's their overall impact perceived to be? Do they help or hinder investment and efficiency in the agricultural sector?
That's the million-euro question, really. While many of these M5 measures are clearly designed with aims like limiting speculation or preventing excessive land concentration, particularly by non-active or foreign investors, they can also inadvertently hinder the inflow of much-needed capital into the agricultural sector.
By making transactions more complex or uncertain.
Exactly. Foreign investments, or even domestic non-agricultural investments, under the right conditions, can bring not only crucial capital for modernization, but also new technologies, innovative business models, and valuable external know-how, all of which can significantly improve agricultural productivity, sustainability, and competitiveness.
But these benefits depend on the market conditions.
Absolutely. These benefits are best realized when markets are competitive, transparent, and information is reasonably accessible. Overly complex or protectionist M5 regulations can stifle this. The overarching policy recommendation, often emerging from analyses like the JRC report, is that instead of outright prohibitions or excessively complex restrictions, policy should ideally focus on creating transparent, competitive markets to provide the right incentives for all market players, local, foreign, farming, non-farming, to act responsibly and productively with the land resource.
Finding that balance again between control and dynamism. That's a really insightful overview of the various regulatory categories and their implications. Now, let's zoom in on a specific case that brings many of these concepts vividly to life. Bulgaria. What makes Bulgaria's agricultural land market particularly interesting, and what recent changes have we seen there that illustrate these wider European trends and tensions?
Bulgaria is a fascinating case, absolutely. Its agricultural sector has undergone huge transformations since the end of socialism, involving mass restitution of land to former owners or their heirs, which initially created extreme fragmentation, and its land market regulations have often been right at that intersection of deeply held national policy goals like protecting local ownership and the evolving framework of EU law.
Okay, so where do we start with understanding the Bulgarian context?
Well, first, to really understand the market dynamics and pricing, it's important to grasp Bulgaria's rather unique system of agricultural land quality classification. It's quite formalized.
Unique how? What are these categories based on? Is it just soil type?
It's more comprehensive than just soil type. Bulgarian agricultural land is meticulously categorized into 10 distinct productivity levels, from Category 1, highest quality, down to Category 10, lowest quality.
And what determines the category?
These categories are based on a complex assessment considering a range of factors. Inherent soil fertility, yes, but also specific climatic conditions of the location, the land's relief or slope, its technological qualities like suitability for mechanization, its suitability for growing various high-value crops, and any natural limitations on land use, such as significant erosion risk.
So a very detailed assessment.
Very detailed. The first and second categories denote the absolute highest quality land, based on a point system scoring over 81 out of 100 in the assessment. The quality then gradually decreases down to the 10th category, which scores 10 points or less. Crucially, the land's official category directly influences its market price, and often its rental value higher category means a significantly higher price. It provides a very clear, quantifiable measure of inherent land value within the country, which is quite useful for the market.
Okay, that's a helpful baseline. So how was Bulgaria regulating its agricultural land market around 2020, which is the snapshot from the JRC report, before some of the most recent legal shifts we alluded to?
Right. Around 2020, Bulgaria had several notable regulations in place, many aimed at controlling who could acquire land, particularly following its EU accession and the end of transitional periods that initially restricted foreign ownership.
So foreigners could buy land by then?
Generally, yes, EU citizens had the right to acquire land. However, there were significant acquisition restrictions still in place based on residency. Natural persons individuals needed to prove they had been legally resident in Bulgaria for over 5 years before they could buy agricultural land.
5 years is quite a long time. What about companies?
Similar rule. Legal entities needed to be established and registered in Bulgaria for over 5 years. Or, if the company was newer, its partners or the members of its managing board needed to meet that 5-year residency requirement individually.
So a pretty clear hurdle designed to limit acquisition by non-local EU investors or recently established companies.
Yes. There was an important exception, however, for self-employed farmers from other EU countries who could prove they were genuinely and permanently settling in Bulgaria to establish a farm. They could bypass the 5-year rule.
Okay, so favoring actual settlement. And how did they manage the process of ownership changes and try to prevent fragmentation?
Every ownership change, every sale, required witnessing and registration by a public notary. This notary wasn't just a rubber stamp. They were legally responsible for meticulously checking and ensuring the legality of the entire transaction, including verifying the buyer met the residency requirements and that all other rules were followed. This added a significant layer of scrutiny and formal oversight to the market.
And did they use preemptive rights too?
Yes, similar to what we discussed under M2 for other countries, neighboring farmers and also co-owners held preemptive rights to acquire agricultural land when it came up for sale. This is a provision specifically aimed at reducing land fragmentation by favoring consolidation among neighbors and also preventing further subdivision of co-owned plots.
And direct anti-fragmentation rules.
Yes. Bulgaria also had M4 measures in place. Absolute minimum size limits below which plots of agricultural land simply could not be divided during a sale or inheritance, a direct legal barrier to creating even smaller plots.
What about tenancy contracts in Bulgaria? Were they long-term, like in France or Belgium, or more flexible?
Bulgaria actually had two main types of tenancy contracts, and they differed quite significantly in their structure and regulation. First, there were formal lease contracts. These had a minimum duration of 4 years and a maximum of 50 years, so potentially very long term. Crucially, these lease contracts were required to be formally registered in writing.
And they offered protection.
Yes, these contracts offered considerable protection, particularly for non-farmer owners leasing their land out. They included provisions requiring a detailed property sketch or map to be attached, and allowed for streamlined bailiff enforcement procedures in case of non-payment of rent, ensuring clarity and enforceability for the landlord.
Okay, that sounds quite formal. What was the second type?
The second type was called a rental contract, dogovorza arenda. These had no minimum duration, but a maximum term of only 5 years. Significantly, these could even be concluded orally, just a verbal agreement, and registration was not mandatory.
Oral contracts for land? That sounds like it could lead to problems.
It could, unfortunately, lead to opacity and potential manipulation or disputes later on. For neither type of contract was automatic renewal the default, though existing tenants generally held preemptive rights for renewal if the owner decided to lease it out again. And generally, tenancy contracts were not inheritable by the tenant's heirs unless the contract explicitly specified that they were.
So, quite different from the French system of inheritable leases. What role did public land play in Bulgaria's agricultural landscape? You mentioned the state owned a lot.
Yes, approximately one-third of Bulgaria's agricultural land is state or municipality owned, making public bodies very significant players in the market.
How is this public land used or managed?
Vacant public land is typically rented out via competitive, tender, or auction procedures. The terms are generally limited, often a maximum of 10 years for arable land, though longer terms, maybe up to 30 years, might be offered for establishing permanent crops like orchards or vineyards to encourage that long-term investment.
And can the state sell land?
Sales of public land also happen, again, usually through competitive procedures like auctions. Eligible participants are typically required to be registered farmers, ensuring the land goes to active agricultural producers. This public land is an important policy tool, often used strategically to compensate former owners whose original land couldn't be returned during restitution, or to facilitate farm expansion, particularly for small and young farmers.
And were there moratoriums on resale like we saw in other countries?
Yes, there was a moratorium preventing the quick resale or transfer of ownership of land that had been acquired directly from the state or municipalities. And generally, a moratorium on selling public land acquired this way existed, again, clearly aimed at preventing quick speculative transactions involving former public assets.
Okay, so summing that up. A market with significant state ownership, rules favoring resident buyers, anti-fragmentation measures, and a dual tenancy system. But you hinted at a recent major shift, didn't you? Something significant happened in 2024 involving the EU court.
This is where that ongoing tension between national protectionism and EU single market principles directly impacted Bulgaria in a very concrete way. In a significant development on January 18, 2024, the EU Court of Justice, the CJEU, delivered a landmark ruling in case CT-6222.
And what did the court rule?
The CJEU explicitly ruled against Bulgaria's local law restrictions that have required EU citizens, both individuals and companies their partners, to have 5 years of residency or establishment in Bulgaria before being allowed to buy agricultural land.
So the court said that 5-year residency requirement violated EU law.
Precisely. It found it to be a disproportionate restriction on the free movement of capital, one of the fundamental freedoms guaranteed by the EU treaties.
That ruling from the EU Court of Justice regarding Bulgaria sounds really significant. What are the practical implications we can expect to see on the ground now that those residency restrictions are gone? What does it mean for the market?
Well, this decision is widely expected to lead to, and I quote from analyses, possible shifts in the agricultural land market and the entry of institutional investors into Bulgaria's agricultural sector.
So opening the door wider to outside investment.
Essentially, yes. It removes a key legal barrier that previously limited non-local EU investors, both individuals and corporate entities, from easily acquiring agricultural land in Bulgaria. This could potentially open up the market to more capital inflow, possibly leading to larger-scale investments, potentially more land consolidation driven by these investors, and maybe even the introduction of more sophisticated farming techniques or business models.
But potentially also driving up prices and making it harder for local farmers.
That's the potential downside, and the fear often expressed when such markets open up. It's a direct outcome of that ongoing tension we've discussed, a member state's desire to protect its local market versus the EU's fundamental principle of free movement of capital. It's undoubtedly a moment of significant potential change for Bulgaria's agricultural future, the full effects of which will likely unfold over the coming years.
A huge change for the Bulgarian market indeed. And finally, just on Bulgaria, what about transparency and land ownership there? If someone, say an investor or neighbor, wanted to know who owns a particular piece of agricultural land, could they find out? Is it public information?
Yes, interestingly, unlike some countries where land ownership information can be quite opaque or difficult to access, Bulgaria actually has relatively public records that allow for ownership checks, at least to a certain extent.
How does that work? Is there an online registry?
There is. You can use the National Cadastry System, which has a public-facing website, kaitas.cadastre.bg, to find a specific property using its map location or other details, and get its unique identification number.
Okay, so you get the property ID. Then what?
Then, armed with that identification number, you can use the online portal of the registry agency. That's at portal.registryagency.bg. For a small administrative fee, maybe around 1 Bulgarian lev, you can typically retrieve the registered owner's name associated with that property ID number.
So you can actually get the owner's name. That's quite transparent. But what about more private contact details, like a phone number or address?
No. While the owner's name is generally accessible, more private information like phone numbers or private home addresses are typically not available directly through these public portals. This illustrates a practical and understandable balance that many systems aim for, providing enough public transparency to facilitate legitimate inquiries, transactions, and accountability while still protecting individuals' personal privacy and data. It's about making essential ownership information available without compromising sensitive personal details.
Okay, that makes sense. We've journeyed through the intricate world of Europe's farmland regulations, with a really insightful special stop in Bulgaria and a glimpse at the dynamic changes happening there due to EU law. Now, let's try to step back and look at the grand picture again. How do these regulations truly compare across the EU as a whole? What challenges remain unresolved? And what might the future hold for this absolutely vital sector?
Well, stepping back, what's perhaps most fascinating and what the JRC report really confirms is the sheer mosaic of regulations across the member states. Diverse institutional histories, economic conditions, political priorities, and agricultural structures have just created this incredibly wide array of rules.
So there's absolutely no one-size-fits-all approach being used.
Not at all. There is definitely no optimal one-size-fits-all set of regulations that works perfectly for every country or every situation. Each nation's specific history, its path of land reform, its typical farm structure, all of these deeply influence its approach to regulating land markets.
But despite the diversity, are there clear patterns we can see? Maybe differences between, say, the older Western European member states and the newer ones from Central and Eastern Europe?
Absolutely. We definitely observe some broad patterns, though there are exceptions to every rule, of course. Countries like Croatia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, many of which are newer member states that joined the EU since 2004, tend to have, on average, more heavily regulated land markets.
And what drives that heavy regulation?
Their regulations often prioritize protecting traditional family farms and explicitly supporting local, small-scale, and young farmers. There's also often a strong emphasis on curbing speculation or preventing excessive land concentration, especially by large-scale corporate investors or foreign buyers. This is frequently a direct response to the economic shifts and sometimes painful transitions experienced following the end of socialism and their subsequent EU accession. They're often trying to prevent perceived negative consequences of rapid market opening.
Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum, heavily regulated, often newer member states. What about the other end?
In stark contrast, countries like Czechia, despite its fragmentation issue, Denmark, Ireland, and Finland tend to adopt a much more liberal stance toward their agricultural land markets. They generally have fewer restrictions on who can buy or rent land and under what conditions.
So their markets are more open.
Generally, yes. Their markets are typically more open to capital flows, both domestic and foreign, and their rules are less prescriptive about the specific profile of the landowner or farmer. There's more emphasis on market mechanisms.
You mentioned earlier that even countries with historically strict tenancy laws, like France and Belgium, are evolving, perhaps in surprising ways. They're not static.
No, not entirely static. That's a significant trend worth highlighting. Countries with those historically very strict tenancy regulations, such as Belgium, France, and also the Netherlands, have actually observed some of those perverse effects we discussed earlier.
Like landlords becoming reluctant to rent out land.
Exactly. That reluctance inadvertently made it harder for new farmers to enter the sector via renting, potentially stifling dynamism. This realization has prompted some of them, notably the Netherlands, to actually loosen their regulations somewhat in recent years. For instance, by introducing liberalized tenancy contracts for certain situations, which offer more flexibility to both the landlord and the tenant compared to the traditional, very long-term, highly protected leases. It shows a pragmatic adaptation to observed market realities.
So even the strictest systems can adapt, and Denmark is a really compelling example of a country that seems to have completely shifted its paradigm over time, isn't it?
Denmark is a fascinating case study of policy change, yes. Traditionally, Danish policy focused heavily on owner cultivation, with legal obligations for owners not only to run the farm, but often even to live on the property.
Very traditional farmer must live on the land idea.
Very much so. But over the decades, Denmark has seen a dramatic increase in the amount of agricultural land that is rented. It went from less than 10% back in the 1960s to a remarkable 40% or more by 2020.
Wow, that's a huge shift towards renting. Why did that happen?
This shift occurred precisely because Denmark gradually abolished many of those strict self-cultivation and residency requirements for owners. This highlights a broader trend, or at least a recognition in some countries, of the economic and practical benefits of more fluid rental markets for agricultural development and structural adjustment, rather than clinging rigidly to owner occupancy rules which can limit flexibility and access.
So, across this diverse landscape, there's this constant push and pull between national policy choices and the broader EU framework. That EU law versus national policy dilemma seems to be an ever-present undercurrent throughout all of this discussion. It keeps coming up.
It truly is the core tension, Peter, and it's unlikely to disappear anytime soon, simply because land is such a fundamental and sensitive issue. On one side, you have the EU's foundational principle of free movement of capital enshrined in the treaties, which applies to agricultural land just as it does to stocks or bonds.
The single market principle.
Exactly. But on the other side, member states legitimately want to impose restrictions to protect what they perceive as vital national public interest related to agricultural land. We've mentioned preserving traditional agricultural communities, ensuring sustainable agriculture practices, preventing excessive land speculation that could destabilize local economies or price out local farmers.
And it all seems to come down to that word again, proportionate. How do they possibly balance that in practice? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is incredibly difficult, both legally and politically. Defining what constitutes proportionate protection measures that are suitable, necessary, and don't go further than needed to achieve a legitimate public interest objective is inherently complex and often highly contested. This ambiguity frequently leads to interventions by the CJEU, as we've seen vividly with the recent Bulgarian case and also previously with rulings concerning land regulations in Latvia and Slovakia, among others.
And the Commission flags issues too.
Yes. The European Commission monitors national laws and often flags regulations it sees as potentially discriminatory or disproportionate, initiating infringement procedures. Yet, as the JRC report notes, many of these contested regulations still remain in place across various countries, sometimes for years. This really demonstrates the ongoing, nuanced, and often politically charged nature of this legal balancing act across Europe. National governments are often reluctant to change laws that are popular domestically, even if they clash with EU principles.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper now into the specific effects of some of these regulations we've discussed. What have we learned, for instance, about the real-world impact of requiring acquirer experience or qualification that some countries impose? Does it truly achieve its aim of better farming?
Well, while certainly intended with the good aim of improving agricultural productivity and environmental stewardship by ensuring buyers know something about farming, these requirements can be a bit of a double-edged sword in practice. A too narrow or outdated definition of agricultural experience can inadvertently limit the entry of individuals who might bring other incredibly vital skills to modern, evolving agriculture. Think about people with cutting-edge technical expertise in things like precision agriculture, data analytics, or robotics, or people with crucial managerial and financial skills needed to run large, complex, modern farming operations efficiently and sustainably.
So it might block innovation.
It potentially could. This raises a fundamental question for policymakers. Are such strict prior experience requirements truly necessary to achieve the desired outcomes of good land stewardship? Or would simply ensuring the land is kept in active agricultural use and farmed according to certain environmental standards suffice, regardless of the owner's specific background or initial qualifications? It's about not potentially stifling innovation or beneficial diversification of skills within the sector.
That's a critical point. And preemptive rights, we've discussed them in the context of tenants, neighbors, co-owners. But how broadly are they used under M5 to steer the market beyond just fragmentation or tenant security?
Beyond those specific groups, preemptive rights granted to other entities like state bodies, specific regional authorities, or even wider family members can be incredibly powerful tools for targeted intervention. They effectively allow specific chosen entities or groups to steer the land market towards particular public policy objectives.
Like what kind of objectives?
Depending on who holds the right, these could include preventing excessive land concentration in certain areas, facilitating smooth family farm succession beyond just direct heirs, promoting broader land consolidation efforts, ensuring land is available for environmental protection schemes, or even securing land needed for future public infrastructure projects. They're a very direct, though potentially market-distorting, intervention mechanism.
And residence requirements. Those seem pretty straightforward in their intent keeping land local. But what's the final analysis on their impact?
They are straightforward in intent, yes. Residence requirements directly aim to protect local ownership patterns and discourage non-local investment, often fueled by legitimate local fears of land grabbing by outside speculators or large corporations, or the hollowing out of rural communities. However, they can also clearly be seen as highly restrictive to the free flow of capital and investment within the EU's single market, creating significant barriers that run counter to that core principle. It's a classic trade-off between local protectionism and market integration.
What about that broad category, M5, the other measures? We talked about publication rules, share deals, moratoriums. Are they particularly significant in the overall regulatory picture, especially maybe in the newer member states?
Yes, the JRC analysis suggests that this other measures category is surprisingly significant, and it does seem to be disproportionately represented in the regulatory frameworks of newer member states, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe.
Why might that be?
It likely reflects their specific efforts and concerns during the post-accession period to manage the opening of their land markets and limit perceived risks of speculation and concentration, especially by non-active or foreign investors, after transitional periods ended. While some of these measures, like the publication of sale offers, can potentially increase market transparency if implemented well,
There's a downside.
they can also add significant complexity, costly delays, and uncertainty to transactions, ultimately impacting market fluidity and potentially dampening legitimate investment. The very fine line to walk between ensuring necessary oversight and market integrity and creating unnecessary bureaucracy that stifles beneficial economic activity.
So looking forward now, what are the really persistent challenges still facing Europe's agricultural land markets, despite all these varied regulations? And what crucial questions still remain unanswered for researchers and policymakers trying to improve things?
Well, one major persistent challenge, as we've touched upon, is fragmentation. It remains a significant, deeply entrenched structural issue in many countries. Czechia, Croatia, Italy, Slovakia, parts of France, Spain, Poland. The list goes on. Despite various M4 measures being implemented over decades, fragmentation continues to lead to high transaction costs, operational inefficiencies, and difficulties in adopting modern practices. It's just very hard to undo centuries of inheritance patterns.
So the existing tools aren't fully solving it. What else?
Another critical issue is enforcement. Are these regulations, often complex and detailed on paper, even being effectively enforced on the ground?
Good question. Do we know?
The evidence suggests enforcement is often patchy, and this can undermine the intended effects of the regulations. The JRC report cites examples like potentially opaque decision-making processes by land transfer commissions in Austria, where it's not always clear or predictable why approvals are granted or denied. In France, there's the issue of some transactions simply being unnotified to the safers, allowing them to bypass scrutiny.
And Slovakia.
In Slovakia, there have been documented problems with problematic rental contracts, sometimes even involving double declarations for key AP direct payments, where two different farmers might try to claim the right to subsidies for using the same piece of land, creating significant conflicts and administrative headaches. Effective, transparent, and consistent enforcement is absolutely key for any regulation to work, and it's clearly not always robust across the board.
And how do other broader policies outside of specific land law interact with these regulations? It seems like they could have a massive influence, maybe even bigger than the land rules themselves.
They absolutely do. You can't look at land regulations in isolation. Their effectiveness is heavily influenced by the surrounding policy ecosystem, particularly tax policies. For example, as we mentioned with Ireland, but also seen in Italy and elsewhere, strategic use of tax breaks and incentives can significantly stimulate longer-term leases or promote active farming versus passive landholding, or encourage land transfers to younger generations.
So tax policy can nudge behavior in ways direct regulation might not.
Precisely. These external policies, tax, inheritance law, environmental regulations, credit policies, can significantly alter market dynamics and the behavior of landowners and farmers, often more profoundly than specific land laws alone might achieve. It's a complex ecosystem of interacting policies that shapes outcomes.
And finally, what do researchers still need to figure out about all this? What are the big unknowns that need more investigation?
The JRC report itself explicitly highlights the crucial need for much more research to truly understand the efficiency and effectiveness of these incredibly diverse national land market regulations in actually achieving the ambitious goals of the new Common Agricultural Policy and the broader EU Green Deal strategy.
Goals like sustainability and generational renewal.
Exactly. Think about key objectives like facilitating necessary land restructuring for improved efficiency and environmental outcomes, successfully enabling young farmer entry against the tide of aging demographics, or genuinely promoting productive and sustainable investments in land management and climate adaptation. The big question is, what specific sets of regulations or combinations of policies genuinely support these critical objectives across different national contexts, and which might inadvertently hinder them or create unexpected negative side effects?
So we need more evidence on what actually works best.
We desperately need more empirical evidence. This area is ripe for deeper comparative study using robust data and methodologies. The answers would be absolutely vital for informing future policy design and helping member states navigate that difficult path towards a more sustainable, dynamic, and equitable agricultural future across Europe.
We certainly journeyed through a complex and incredibly diverse landscape today, the landscape of agricultural land market regulations across the European Union. From protecting tenants and family farmers to battling fragmentation and managing public land, we've seen how each country navigates a unique path. It's often a delicate balancing act, isn't it, between deeply held national values and traditions and the broader principles and legal frameworks of EU law.
It really is. It sounds a bit like Europe's agricultural land market is this giant, ever-evolving, and incredibly intricate board game. Each country is playing by slightly different rules, shaped by its own history, and the EU is acting as the overarching referee, occasionally blowing the whistle when a national rule seems to step too far out of bounds of the single market principles.
That's a great analogy. And what's abundantly clear from our discussion is that agricultural land is far, far more than just a commodity. It's a truly foundational asset, deeply intertwined with economic stability, environmental sustainability, and the very social fabric of rural communities across the continent.
Absolutely. And the regulations governing its market inevitably reflect this profound complexity. We've seen how each rule, each policy choice, carries both intended benefits, often very laudable ones, and frequently surprising, sometimes even contradictory, unintended consequences that policymakers have to grapple with.
So the big question remains, what does this whole mosaic of rules mean for you, the listener, and for the future of Europe's farms, its food security, and its rural vitality? As the EU continues to push hard for a more sustainable and equitable agricultural future through major initiatives like the Green Deal.
How can member states possibly harmonize their incredibly diverse national approaches to land markets? Or can they even achieve harmonization? Is it even desirable?
Or perhaps the question is, can they genuinely strike that delicate balance we keep coming back to? That balance between protecting legitimate local interests and traditional structures and embracing the potential economic efficiencies and innovation that might come from a more fluid, less restricted, more integrated European land market.
Can they ensure prosperity and opportunity for all who rely on the land? From the smallest family farm to the largest cooperative, from the established farmer to the young, hopeful entrant.
It's a fundamental question, and the answers, found or not found, will continue to shape the European countryside, its economy, and its society for generations to come. It will determine not just what we eat, but who farms the land that produces it and how they and the land itself thrive in the future.